Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it. I know that you are not a class. You are not assigned to be here. You have chosen to be here. And so that is all the more sort of honor for me. The title of the talk that I'm going to give is Gentrification and the Next Urban Crisis, which is somewhat ominous, and that is intentional. And so I don't want there to be a cloud hanging over us that this is going to get too dark. And I'm going to begin by just giving you a summary of what I'm going to say. I'm going to give away all of my best points. First, what does gentrification mean for cities today? I'm not entirely sure anymore. I don't think we know. I don't think we know across cities and across neighborhoods what to expect. It's become incredibly multifaceted and difficult to understand. And so given that, what can be done to prevent it? I'm not entirely sure that it matters at this point. I think that the changes that are going to come to cities are going to hit faster than anything we could do to disrupt gentrification. And so where cities are going is sort of a runaway train. We can do things to lessen the impacts and reshape cities moving forward, but I'm not sure that preventing gentrification is the way to think about where cities need to go. And so at this point, this is probably the worst TED Talk you've ever heard. I've admitted that I don't know much, but hopefully I can take you on sort of a winding path to understand this issue better. It's going to sort of jump around both in time and space. We're going to begin at the present. We're going to go back in time to understand how we got to where we are now. And then we'll move forward and try to understand where cities are going to go. And so in this present moment, gentrification is a hot button issue. People are protesting it all across the country. There are obviously debates going on in Austin now about new developments and how the city should change. And I think that this woman captures these debates really well with this sign. Only 3 words: gentrification, new colonialism. And that's obviously heavy wording. It's weighted. Right? Colonialism we know now to be a bad thing. We know that colonialism is bad. 2 centuries ago, colonialism wasn't thought to be that bad. And I think this is part of the equivalence, trying to understand what about gentrification could be similar to colonialism. I think that to some degree this is a fair criticism, and in some ways it's also hyperbolic, right, as we see the changes that cities have undergone. But to understand her perspective, to understand why we're so concerned about gentrification and why people are so angry about the process of change, we have to go backwards and forward. Gentrification is not a new process. It is not something that has arisen recently. It was first coined as a term by Ruth Glass, a British scholar, and she was studying London back in the 1960s and noticed these changes. The United Kingdom and London had undergone changes not dissimilar to the United States. The wealthy had moved out of the city. They were living in wealthier communities further from the center of London. And what Ruth Glass noticed was sort of this interesting change of working class neighborhoods beginning to get turned over, have higher displacement as the wealthy moved back into these neighborhoods. The sorts of services and restaurants that were available changed, the character of these neighborhoods changed. And what she termed this change as gentrification, which carries this sort of British weight to it, the idea of the gentry moving into working class neighborhoods. I don't think an American scholar would have come up with that term, but it's become one of the most popular terms in urban policy. And so this isn't a new process. This isn't a new phenomenon that's going on. It's been studied in England and the United States ever since. And it goes back as a process at least through to the 1970s. And this is when we have sort of reliable data. And I'll spend a few minutes on this graph and going back and forth to make sure that we're all on the same page by what I mean very specifically by gentrification, because it can be defined a number of different ways. And so on this graph, I'm showing both the neighborhoods that are eligible to gentrify and the number that did gentrify over a 10-year period in the 50 largest states and cities in the United States. So what do I mean by this? So by neighborhoods, I mean census tracts. The census collects data every 10 years, and it wants to report it for states, it reports it for the country, and it also wants to report it for communities. And so the census has defined these small groupings of blocks and streets that are called census tracts as generally neighborhoods. They follow main arteries and roads. They try to comport to the residents' ideas of neighborhoods, but not perfectly. They try to be sort of homogeneous in terms of the social class within each one. And you can see here for Austin, all of the census tracts plotted out. You can There aren't sort of dark lines around them, but you can see where the colors change, and this is graphing out the income of the city. And so this is the median income. And so you can get an idea of what I mean by neighborhood. It's these small blocks of streets and neighborhoods. When I talk about neighborhoods, I'm talking about census tracts. Occasionally I'll say census tracts. What I mean is neighborhoods. The two sort of go hand in hand in sort of my wording. And so that's what I mean by neighborhoods. When a neighborhood is eligible to gentrify, it has a housing stock that is older than the rest of the region, older than the rest of the Austin region in the case of a tract in the city of Austin, and it has an income lower than the region. Older housing, low income, at the beginning of a decade. At the end of that decade, if it has had an increase in the housing prices, adjusting for inflation, an increase in the housing prices and an increase in the number of college graduates above the median for the city, then it is said to have gentrified. And so all of these processes occur over a decade. That's mostly because that's how we actually get them measured, right? Scholars are always working with the tools that they have. But I think this is the best definition of gentrification that we have in the literature. It's from Lance Freeman at Columbia University. And it captures both sort of the change in the character of a neighborhood and the economic changes. And so when I say that a neighborhood is gentrified, right, it's capturing all four of these conditions. And it's not perfect, but I think that it's a really useful comparison for looking at neighborhoods. So before I moved to New Orleans, about 2 years before I moved there, I got really curious about this question of how Hurricane Katrina impacted the city of New Orleans and whether Hurricane Katrina led neighborhoods to gentrify at a faster or slower rate in terms of the recovery after the storm. And this definition gave me an easy way to compare the different tracts. Right? I could see which tracts were eligible to gentrify and which ones had gentrified. And so I looked at the damage from Hurricane Katrina at the census tract level. It may have been that damaged neighborhoods were less likely to gentrify because of the sort of reciprocal damage and the sort of costs associated with rebuilding those neighborhoods. Or it may have been that that damage so cleanly wiped out those neighborhoods, all of the residents were displaced, all of the buildings had to be torn down anyways. The developers would look at it as a new opportunity to rebuild those sections of the city. And that's exactly what I found. Neighborhoods that were more impacted by Hurricane Katrina were more likely to gentrify a decade later. So it's a really useful comparison, looking at both the eligible tracts and the ones that gentrified. And I'll use that throughout this presentation. And so now back to this graph. What is being shown is that gentrification is not a new process. There was a sort of stable number of tracts that were eligible to gentrify decade over decade from the 1970s through 2000, about 6,200 tracts that were eligible to gentrify. And generally, the rate of tracts that did gentrify was sort of stable. It was about a quarter of those tracts that did gentrify each decade. And this sort of persisted through the 1980s, the 1990s, into the 2000s. And suddenly, in the new century, we had this accelerating rate of gentrification. It's both a decrease in the number of tracts that could gentrify, so there was less affordable housing that people could move to within these cities, and an uptick in the number of tracts that did gentrify during that decade. And so I think this goes to partially explain why we're more concerned about gentrification now. It's this accelerating rate and this loss of affordable housing within cities. But there's also more to it. Right? So what does gentrification mean for cities today? It's not entirely clear. There was a lot of hopes that were put on gentrification. And when I first moved to Atlanta, a city that is rapidly gentrified, if you had asked me, I would have said that gentrification was the best hope for the city to revitalize. And I think that city planners, city managers, mayors had a very similar viewpoint, and they may have still the same viewpoint. But the benefits that one would hope would come along with gentrification have not yet materialized. One hope would be that middle-class families moving into a city would renew the tax base, increase the amount of services that could be offered. There were a lot of hopes that this would improve the public education system, having middle-class families bring their kids and introducing them to the public education system. And there have not been very many effects on education overall. In part, this is because gentrifiers are smart in where they live. They will find the affordable housing within the public school zone that sends their kids to the better school. They're sending kids to magnet schools, right? There's a lot of school choice that's been a popular sort of mantra of governments, and gentrifiers are exercising this to sort of as far as they can. And so there haven't been very many improvements in public education. Public education isn't the only place that your tax dollars go, but part of the problem is the government stripped back public services so much in the 1970s and 1980s that there hasn't actually been much absorption of new taxes. And so I think this is most viscerally shown in Detroit. One would hope that sort of the police department would improve there, but there hasn't actually been a decrease in sort of your waiting time if you call the police. So if you call the police from a non-gentrified neighborhood, you will probably wait an hour for a car to come and check on your break-in. If you call it from a gentrified neighborhood, you will make the call to your private police force that you support through your homeowner association or your neighborhood association. A car from the private police force will arrive in 5 minutes. They will route the call through to the police more rapidly, and the police will arrive very soon. And so we've found ways, gentrifiers have found ways to concentrate their public benefits within their neighborhoods, within their enclaves. And part of this has to do with sort of the decentralization of government. One of my research projects right now is looking at nonprofits and the types of nonprofits that arise in communities when they're gentrifying versus not gentrified. And we're using the mission statements of those nonprofits to understand whether they are working for what we would define as a vulnerable community, whether their benefits are extending to the whole community or whether they're concentrated within certain groups or certain neighborhoods. And we find exactly that gentrifying neighborhoods are more likely to found nonprofits that concentrate their benefits within their sort of reach. And that's within the residents' sort of right? It was unfair of us to expect them to create nonprofits that would revitalize the entire city. But it's part of the reality of gentrification that we have not seen public services improve as a result. One may also hope that residential segregation would decrease as a result of gentrification. Residential segregation, the segregation of the races throughout cities, increased decade after decade from the 1930s on. Every decade, America became more racially segregated. And if gentrifiers are moving back into declining areas, and especially areas with high concentrations of African Americans, one would hope, one would suppose that this would reduce residential segregation. Cities are becoming more diverse, but gentrification isn't a great predictor of whether cities are having declining residential segregation. And in part, this is again because not all neighborhoods are equally likely to gentrify. If you look at tracts that do gentrify and don't gentrify, tracts that do gentrify typically have a lower share of African Americans in them. This is still a sort of impediment to revitalization within neighborhoods, having neighborhoods with a high share of African Americans. The trend is moving upward. There are fewer and fewer tracts within cities with low shares of African Americans to gentrify. It's probably part of the explainer. And I'm really curious at the end of the next decade whether that trend will continue. But gentrifiers are not picking neighborhoods sort of at random. Different things make them more or less attractive. Along with breaking up residential segregation, one would hope that concentrated poverty within cities may decrease as a result of gentrification. A decade ago, there were a lot of great news articles about how you could buy an entire city block in Detroit for $1. I thought about doing it as an investment, but I declined to because I realized that that was a terrible idea. So we would hope that these sort of dilapidated areas, these declining areas of concentrated poverty would get broken up by gentrification if gentrifiers are moving into these declining areas and fixing up these houses which are abandoned. But it's a very similar story to the share of African Americans. Neighborhoods with a higher share of poverty are less likely to gentrify. This is an impediment to gentrification that continues. And in cities with a higher rate of gentrification, you actually get an increasing concentration of poverty. It's the sort of the poorest, the most vulnerable that are getting displaced from these neighborhoods, and they're being sent to these neighborhoods where there is already a high share of poverty. And so rather than breaking up the concentrated poverty within cities, it's actually sort of exacerbating this problem and creating a more unequal city. The final sort of benefit that was supposed to occur as a result of gentrification would be an increase in jobs and services with people moving back to the city. And to some degree, this has been found. There's very mixed findings on the rates of displacement as a result of gentrification, in part because jobs come along with them. But these are often going to be service jobs in restaurants and cafes and bars and breweries. And these have sort of a low rate of economic mobility, especially with scheduling practices modernly. And so there are some increase in jobs, but whether these are sort of providing an avenue sort of to create a better life for low-income residents, that's one sort of question. Middle-income African Americans see an increase in their incomes as a result of gentrification, but low-income residents are more likely to get pushed out. And so there's some mixed findings with regard to what kind of impact jobs have in these communities. And so that sort of brings you back to the shrug and not knowing what it means, right? We thought that something would happen. It didn't really happen. But there aren't really, the negative impacts aren't that large either. There's some displacement, but there's some staying in place. Schools aren't getting better, but they're not getting much worse. And so looking at sort of a global view, looking across the data, you'd almost think that nothing's happened. But certainly something has happened. Right? The changes in neighborhoods, the changes in the character is certainly there. It's present. This is the St. Roch Market in New Orleans, where there are now sort of 12 restaurants all serving sort of limited menus, and it's serving a gentrified sort of community. It's gone through changes over the last 80 years from a low-income grocery store to a small market, and now it's serving the new clientele to live in the St. Roch neighborhood. There's been changes, and we can't really deny that, but we can't find these at sort of the global level looking across cities because it depends so heavily on the neighborhood characteristics and the city characteristics of what's going on. But something is happening, right? Something is happening, and people are upset. And so to understand that, I think we have to look past the consequences. We have to look past the outputs. It's not the outputs that have people upset about gentrification, although that is certainly what's being protested. I don't think it's the outputs. I think it's the inputs. And that goes back to this idea of what causes gentrification. Right? In the popular media, in sort of a news story, they'll talk about young home buyers, young yuppies, young hipsters, hipster families coming in, the new cafe that opens, the new bar, all of these new amenities, right? And this attracts some of the protest. But this isn't what causes gentrification. Right? This is just another output of gentrification, the sort of change in the character of neighborhoods. And I don't think that it's their fault. And in part, this is sort of self-preservation, as I am myself a gentrifier. Right? I have moved into neighborhoods that were revitalizing, right? And I know that I carry some blame for that, but I don't know how I could have changed my behavior to sort of have been a better resident of a city. I don't think living in the suburbs was a good idea. I don't think I could have afforded to live in a better neighborhood. Right? I want to absolve myself by looking at a higher level at the institutional sort of context. The best explanation for what causes gentrification is this thing called the rent gap. And this was posed by Neil Smith back in the 1980s. Because the hipster family is just reacting to sort of economic trends within a city. And what Neil Smith proposed was that buildings' values fall over time. That's generally inarguable. The day that you build the house, it typically has the highest value, and it will decline over time. But the potential value of that property, of that land, stays typically fairly steady. Right? It is near to the city, the center of the city. Right? It is near certain amenities. The potential value of that land stays consistent, even if there is a declining value of the actual building. And as that building value declines and the value of the property stays steady, a rent gap emerges between the potential and the realized value. And the building will decline over time, and this is a process called filtering. Right? A wealthy person buys the house initially. They move to a newer house 20 years later. They pass it on to a middle-class family, to a low-class family. Eventually, it's torn into a quadplex. Right? And eventually, once it reaches that point, it is worth for the developer to tear it down and start over. Right? The rent gap has gotten large enough that it is worth buying and rebuilding it from the beginning. This is what was exacerbated by Hurricane Katrina. Destroying land left the rent gap wider than it had been before. Right? And so cities have seen this rent gap grow over time. And so this is the economic trend that the yuppies, the hipster families, are reacting to. They see this rent gap and the opportunity to buy affordable housing within a city. But it's more than that, because we have to ask, why did the rent gap get so large? And what I pose is that this is the source of the anger. And it may not be the anger for that woman individually, but I think that collectively it's a reaction to the trends that grew the rent gap. So why did the rent gap get so large? It goes far back. And it goes further back than even the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but that's sort of where the story sort of conveniently begins. But the actual source of the rent gap is federal housing policy. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was founded in 1933. This was during the Great Depression. It was a New Deal era project. And during the Great Depression, people were having home foreclosures at an escalating rate. And you have to understand that mortgages were quite different back then. They were typically 5 to 7 years. You needed to put 70% down for your home, and your payments were not amortized. So when you paid your monthly payment, you were not buying part of the house. You had to make the complete payments over 7 years to own the home, and then you owned it. And that is quite different than what we do modernly. So I just bought a house in New Orleans. I paid 20% down. I'll pay that mortgage over 30 years. Right? It's quite convenient for me. Back in the 1930s, that wasn't the case. And so we had a really high foreclosure rate going into the Great Depression. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation was founded to help families avoid foreclosure. And they ended up giving out about 1 million mortgages, which restructured sort of the financing of homes. They created the idea of a 25-year mortgage, which would even out the payments significantly. They allowed families to pay less on their down payment, and they were also allowing people to buy part of the home with each payment. And so with the federal government stepping into the private housing market, they had to figure out which properties were worth investing in through these mortgages, which properties were likely to have their mortgages repaid. And what they did is they hired local real estate agents to go out and figure out which neighborhoods were likely to have repayments, which properties were likely to maintain value in the future, and which properties were less likely to. And so these real estate agents went out and they drew maps. And so the red is the least valuable properties. These were the worst. And in those areas, there should be no mortgages given out from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Yellow is slightly better, green is still okay, and blue is best. So this is the map for Boston. These maps are always interesting to people. They're hard to interpret unless you know the city. And I can immediately get that I am guessing the south and the east have traditionally been lower income areas. Right? These maps have been shown to predict sort of present median home values fairly accurately, at least through 2000. And so this is where the phrase redlining comes from. Right? If you were in a redline neighborhood, you could not get a mortgage. And so you were blocked out from this program. And I think it becomes more clear if we look at a city that I'm more familiar with. We can go back to the Austin map later. But so this is Atlanta. And in traditional geography, they have this model of the monocentric city, that the value of land will decline from the center of a city. So the center of a city is going to have commercial real estate because it's the most valuable, because that's where everyone needs to go. The wealthy will live just outside of that because they are able to pay to have a short commute. Outside of that will be the working class, right? And the fringes of the city will be the poorest. And this was sort of the model that the University of Chicago proposed back in 1900 before the advent of transportation technology. In Atlanta, we see this flipped on its head. The center of the city was still commercial. The gray area all around it was red. Nobody should have a mortgage in those areas. Surrounding the red is yellow, declining, right? And just outside on the fringes is green and blue, but very little of it within the city of Atlanta. And in case you're wondering what the best predictor of what your grade was, written into the manual was that racial segregation needed to be enforced. And so if the neighborhood had any African Americans, it should be red. Right? And this was all very explicitly written into there. Yellow was typically an area which had Jewish Americans, and that would be considered to be declining. And so you can guess how many sort of WASPs there were in Atlanta in any era or any city based on the Holm maps. But this, of course, is not where the federal government stopped in this era. Because soon after, they founded the Federal Housing Administration in order to advance their sort of new goal of mortgages more steadily. And this was sort of the permanent construction of the 30-year mortgage with the 20% down. And in the manual describing how that they would underwrite these mortgages, it was very explicitly said that neighborhoods should not be racially integrated. And that neighborhoods that receive these mortgages from the FHA, and my mortgage modernly is backed by the FHA. Right, we still carry these things with us. In the underwriting manual, it said artificial or natural barriers between neighborhoods are good in order to prevent the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups. And you can sort of guess what that meant. Right, we need to keep people separate by whatever means necessary. And so the FHA was only going to underwrite mortgages for neighborhoods that were white, and only for white Americans. And so when we go decades later and look at the development of the suburbs were built with FHA mortgages. Looking at something like Levittown, right? Levittown is a famous suburb in New Jersey. In the original contract, where they got backing from the FHA, it was stated that no property would be sold to African Americans and no property would be resold to African Americans. VA home loans helped to expand home ownership to war veterans when they returned. And this program was in name open to all veterans, but of course you also had to get the backing of a private bank. And because a private bank couldn't get backing for the loan from the FHA, very few of those loans were going to go to African Americans. The VA home loans actually had a 0% down payment policy. You didn't have to have anything down. You had to be able to make the payments. But you didn't have to have any money to put down coming back from World War II. And if you look at Levittown and you adjust for inflation, so the homes were sold for about $9,000 at the era. That's about $100,000 modernly. That's twice the median income. And so you can imagine earning the median income and being able to make those monthly payments now. Those homes are about $400,000 now, right? So you could not make that on a median income. And so this is how we sort of reshaped the housing market. And in many ways, it was a giveaway, it was a huge subsidy, and it only benefited a specific segment of the American population. And so African Americans were left behind, unable to get property in these new suburbs that were being built. They were left in cities where they could not get FHA loans in order to buy homes within their neighborhoods. So they were left behind and unable to invest. They couldn't own the land. They couldn't invest in their neighborhoods. Of course, the Highway Aid Act expanded this further, right? Made it easier to get in and out of the cities. And along with a few other trends, right, offshoring of jobs began, plants began to close, jobs moved to the suburbs. There were fewer jobs in the cities as people moved out to the suburbs. And so we can look at the effect of all these policies on the home ownership gap between black and whites across decades. Unfortunately, the question about home ownership only goes back in the census to the 1940. I would love to see what it looked like in 1930. But in 1940, there was a 16.7% gap in home ownership in 1940, right? And that is after the advent of the FHA, after the Holm Corporation. And this graph is actually only showing for individuals that were earning over the median income in that year. And so to some degree, it's holding income and sort of economic class constant, except for sort of the ability to make a down payment. But there's a 16.7% gap in home ownership in 1940. By 1960, that had grown to 20%, right? And into the modern day, following the Great Recession, this gap has grown to 27%. And as far as anyone can tell, it's going to continue to grow. And this is in large part because of the intergenerational transfer of wealth. The reason that I was able to buy a home is because my parents were able to help me with the down payment. They were able to help me with the down payment because they had owned a home. They were able to own a home because their parents had owned a home. My grandfather came back from World War II. He got a VA loan, right? This wealth transfers down. And this is actually a larger problem that we don't talk enough about in this country. We talk about income inequality a lot. And the income gap between African Americans and whites is about 60 cents to the dollar. For every dollar that a white American earns, an African American earns 60 cents. The wealth gap is starkly larger. It's 6 cents to the dollar. African Americans, on average, have 6 cents in wealth to the dollar that the white American has. And this is why the home ownership gap is going to continue to grow, because there's been no transfer of intergenerational wealth. And so when we think about cities and how that they're getting reshaped, certain communities are not going to be able to have a voice in that because of these policies. And so all of this acted together. Right? Economic forces allowed people to leave cities. It may have been that families would want to leave cities anyways. Cities were overcrowded to a degree. It was heavily dependent on apartments. People were having families. The baby boom generation was coming online. People would want their backyards. But federal policy laid out a golden brick road that led everyone out of the city. And what happens when you lead everyone of means out of a city? Things go badly. Right? Crime is going to increase. Hopelessness is going to increase. And in the 1960s, we had the beginning of the urban crisis. Right? What I would think of as the first urban crisis as race riots began to spread, right, and despair set in. And so you have to ask, how do we get out of that? If you're looking at today, right, Austin looks nothing like it did in 1960. How do we get to the modern day? In part, I think that's thanks to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's unintentionally prescient advice. Moynihan was a senator from New York. He is the one in the picture that's not Richard Nixon. But Moynihan was the urban advisor to Richard Nixon, as well as being a senator at different points. And what he told Nixon was that the time may have come when the issue of race could benefit from a period of benign neglect. Benign neglect. That the issues of race in cities needed to be looked away from for a few decades in order to improve. He thought of it as almost a wound that needed to be turned away from to allow it to scab over, and that it would heal itself given enough time. Imagine scabbing your knee. You shouldn't pick at it. But if you have a bleeding wound in your stomach, right, benign neglect is probably not going to heal that. But this idea of benign neglect took hold, and a lot of cities actually practice it to some degree, pulling back on services, particularly in impoverished communities, in order to sort of preserve themselves moving forward. And this occurred most famously in New York when they had to decide how to sort of adjust their fire department. They needed to make cuts, and so they hired the Rand Corporation to figure out where the best cuts would be made. The Rand Corporation recommended removing the fire department in impoverished neighborhoods in order to preserve the neighborhoods that were still of some standing. And so when a neighborhood in New York burned, if it was low income, it burned for days. And the fire spread, and the neighborhoods were destroyed. And this was benign neglect. Look away from the problem because it'll fix itself. And I think that this is actually similar to something we see modernly in professional sports. I think sports is the great analogy because it helps to crystallize some of the trends we see that are a little more serious. In sports, there's a really popular trend in team building called tanking, where you lose as much as you can in order to get high draft picks and accumulate young players in order to one day improve. The Philadelphia 76ers made an art of this. The Houston Astros practiced it for a few years, losing over 100 games, and now they're in their second World Series. Third World Series? Second? Second. Don't want to offend anyone. Right, the Miami Dolphins are trying to do this as much as they can right now. You lose as much as you can. You don't invest in the players you have because you will replace them soon, and you will be better. And I think to some degree that this is what cities practiced. If they could just get worse, if the housing market in cities can just get bad enough, developers will come back because the land will be too valuable not to rebuild. And I don't think that this was intentionally the mayor's plans, but I think unintentionally it explains where cities went from benign neglect to the present. By bottoming out, by cutting back services, you created a market that was hospitable to investment, and now you can reap the rewards of it. Cities like Austin are reaping the rewards, New York, elsewhere. And so that brings us back to the present and where we are. I think that the past helps to sort of illustrate why there's such anger about how we got here. It's not because gentrification itself is bad. It's because gentrification is sort of the final wound of a festering wound. I don't know how better to close that. Right? It's the final sort of loss of dignity, that you were left behind, you weren't allowed to sort of own your neighborhood, and now you have to go. Right? It was never your neighborhood. You may have lived there for 50 years, but you never were a part of it. And so the city is moving on. So where do cities go in the future then? Right? This doesn't wrap up by talking about where the people go. I want to think about where cities go then. Because the present moment may be what I would think of as peak gentrification. We may be in the last decade where a city like New York or Austin can count on low value property being rehabilitated in order to drive the city's growth. And as I think about that, and as I think about this research, I keep ruminating on this Irish proverb. The origins of the next crisis are always sown in the present one. And this gets applied to foreign policy a lot, because if you look back from the vantage point of World War II, you can see that all of the problems were sown during World War I. And if we had just done things differently, we may have avoided World War II. And the Cold War was created by World War II. Right? Modern conflicts were created by the Cold War. All of these crises keep rolling. And so if we can look back and understand how the first urban crisis created the present problems of gentrification, we may be able to think forward about how gentrification may lead to future urban crises. Right? As this becomes, I try to coin the second urban crisis. Since I'm in Austin, and this is a city where this is sort of the heart of it, I thought it worth it to sort of discuss your experiences. And I'm curious what I'm missing and what I may get wrong. I first sort of knew about Austin because it was one of the cities that wanted to stay weird. Portland has these bumper stickers too. Where I did my undergrad, Santa Cruz, California, had Keep Santa Cruz Weird. A lot of cities like to keep weird. I don't know if this is still something you all say, because I assume that you have given up on being weird. It is too expensive to be weird here now. Right? And so there are problems that I've already seen. So driving in, I don't know if you've seen this. There seems to be a homelessness problem. And this is actually a good sign for your city, is the weird thing, because the homeless don't go to cities that are struggling. It is a sign that they can make money off panhandling and get food that is thrown away, that your city is sort of vital enough to sort of support them. But it is also a clear sign that there is not housing for them to live in. Right? But the poor are not, there is not a large homelessness camp in Buffalo, New York. They are in New York City. And so how you deal with these problems is actually something distinct from gentrification. Right? But it's a symptom of the same problems, that there isn't housing that is available to keep people off of the streets. And part of this is shown by just looking at the median home values. So I pulled this up today, so it's not the prettiest graph that I'll ever show you. But these are the median home values for Austin at the census tract level, and this is a bit of the region. And what jumps out to me is that it's all expensive. I know that this is getting into like really impressive findings. Austin is expensive. So the high end of this spectrum, the high end is $1 million. The median home value in your richest neighborhoods is $1 million, which means, and again, I know this is an intro to stats, but median means half of the homes in those neighborhoods are more than $1 million. It is really expensive. Where do you live in this city? So there is still some affordable, if 200,000 is affordable, on sort of the outskirts outside of the city. But there is nothing under 500,000 in the city. That is going to be a problem in the long run, I think. If you look back, this has not always been the trend. So if you look back just to 1990, there was at least more differentiation on the east side. But if you're concerned about gentrification on the east side of Austin, I think it's over. Like, your city is gentrified. There is nothing left to gentrify in the city. It's just sort of rounding up the last few affordable apartments. It is remarkably even out here. Right? From San Antonio to Austin, there is not much of sort of affordable places to live. And so how you sort of keep your city vital through that is really difficult, because it doesn't mean that everyone's left the city, and it doesn't mean that college students can't find anywhere to rent. So this is pulling up, again, the median incomes and comparing that to the home values. It isn't that everyone is rich in Austin. It's just that low-income families are being pushed to the absolute extremes of what they can experience in order to afford to stay in those relatively sort of affordable neighborhoods. It's something similar to someone being put on the rack. I was watching The Princess Bride again recently, right? And there's a torture scene where they start at sort of level 1, I don't know if anyone's ever been tortured by someone in the medieval period, right? You start at sort of, well, this is unaffordable. You know, this is hard to afford. And you keep ratcheting it up. And these families don't quite know how far that they can go. But if you're earning $25,000 a year and you're renting a $200,000 house, you are as far as you can go. And you are making difficult choices about what you can afford to live without. And part of what is so difficult about this is that it's more expensive to rent than to buy. Right? That is why I bought as soon as I moved to New Orleans, because I knew that I would keep losing my down payment month over month. In general, it's about my mortgage is about $300 less than the rent would be on my house. Right? I am saving money every month. These families are losing money every month in order to continue renting in these neighborhoods. And this has a lot to do with how we supply housing and how we sort of build out housing. Right? But evening that out, making it so that we do not sort of capture the benefits of owning month over month would help these families. So that's my quick review of Austin and where you stand. Right? And I think a lot of what I say about New York will apply to Austin as well, and I'm interested in where you see the differences are when I'm done. Because New York has these problems on steroids. If Austin is gentrified, New York is super gentrified. So this map shows dots for individuals. It's 2 households per dot. Each blue dot is a household earning over $200,000. Each yellow dot is a household earning under $25,000. New York and Manhattan has 2 kinds of residents, the ultra-rich and the very poor. Those are the only people that live in Manhattan now. If you are ultra-rich, you're able to afford your apartment, your luxury apartment. If you are very poor, you are probably living with 8 of your best friends, right? Probably your family, right? Because this is largely being sort of led up by immigrants at this point. There's some public housing still in there, right? Maybe your apartment is rent controlled, which means that you're not going to get any repairs, right? But this is what has happened to Manhattan. There's nothing in between ultra-rich and very poor. There's no teachers, there's no professors, there's no firemen, right? There's no nurses. There's none of the things that a city needs to run. They're getting pushed outside of New York City. And so how a city can survive that in the long run becomes difficult. And I don't know that it's possible, and I think we're already starting to see those signs. The 3 largest cities are losing population now. New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. They are all losing population now. For a long time, they were all buoyed by an influx of immigrants. The native-born have been on a net out-migration for about a decade. But immigrants were coming in large enough numbers to replace them. That has changed, right? In part because of policy changes with immigration, but also because it's become too unaffordable for immigrants arriving. And so you're starting to see New York begin to decline. New York's starting to lose its population. And if you are surviving based on the economics of a luxury apartment market, you're going to have a real problem when people stop moving to your city. 1 in 4 luxury apartments built since 2013, 1 in 4 have not been sold in New York City. There is a vast amount of luxury apartments that are sitting idle because realtors will not lower the price, right? It is only a luxury apartment if it has a high price. If it has a moderate price, it's just an apartment. And so they're afraid to lower prices, right, despite this trend of people moving away. These changes happen over time, too. So this is Hudson Park, which was recently opened in New York City, and it is now the highest priced census tract in New York City. The median price is $5 million. The project received $6 billion in subsidies. Right, this is where New York City is putting its emphasis. Despite only having the ultra-rich and the very poor, they are building luxury apartments that sell for $5 million. Who is buying these properties? It's been called a tax laundering haven because of the way that Americans do property tax. People who buy expensive properties like this are able to get sort of a protected rate. foreign investors are buying a lot of these properties. Foreign investors do not come and live in them. About 30% of the luxury apartments sit vacant 10 months of the year. So you have entire neighborhoods, large swaths of the city that sit vacant despite high prices, and that's not a healthy city. And part of the problem is, who are they going to sell it to? Who are you going to sell your $5 million apartment when people stop living in New York and it stops becoming a commodity that's collected? And so one can easily see the bubble coming crashing soon. Right? An apartment that sits vacant has very little intrinsic value. All of the value is put on it by somebody else being willing to pay. And so when this begins to fall, the very wealthy will start to flood out, right? And that may lower median rents, that may lower prices, right? But New York may go through a caving out. And that's part of the problem. If you don't keep your city healthy, if you aren't able to maintain a middle class, right, you are dependent on the wealthy staying in place. So it won't prevent sort of that crash completely. But I do like to champion getting rid of zoning restrictions. Why did developers choose in New York to build luxury apartments? Why do developers often choose to build sort of the most expensive properties they can? In part is because they can only build in one place in one place, right? The recent Dominion project in Austin? Domain. I keep going to Dominion. Domain. So the Domain project in Austin, part of the rezoning was that there would be affordable properties built. Because the developer had to negotiate for the rezoning, right, they are going to want to build as much, as high, as expensive as they can. If we got rid of those zoning restrictions and people were able to allow land to sort of move to its median value throughout a city, we may be able to get around some of that. Part of the problem is that large swaths of the city are going to be controlled by single-family housing. That may be good for your individual property values, right? I want my individual property values to be maintained as well, but it ensures that we're using land in a low-density way no matter where it's built in a city. And we have to move forward and out of that. Oregon has gotten rid of single-family housing, right? All housing zoning was built on the intentional desire to segregate cities. Based on a racial code, those were thrown out. So governments found ways to make new zoning enforce the same things. So single-family housing is sort of a direct descendant of those policies. The reason that you don't want your single-family neighborhood to be changed is because you don't want a certain community character to come in, a certain change in the character of who's residing there. You don't want new people. Right? And we can talk about the euphemisms. I don't blame anyone for this, right? But I think that allowing cities and allowing the use of land to move towards its sort of best use is part of the way forward. And we have to sort of admit that restricting use and raising the cost for developers of building new projects is part of the problem. I don't think that this will solve the problem. And I don't think that this will solve the problem before the problem gets much worse. Right? There will not be enough affordable housing built in New York immediately. Developers are still going to build properties that they make profit off of. That will always be true. But it will often come from individuals changing the character of their neighborhoods that we could actually see more affordable housing offered. Affordable housing is having to move then, because we don't have enough of it, to new locations. And so because, as the rent gap dictates, over time housing loses value. So where is the low-value property now? It's out in the suburbs. Everyone has moved back to the city. So the suburbs are affordable. So we're seeing a huge increase in poverty out in the suburbs. This is a problem because the suburbs were not built for impoverished communities. They were not built with public transportation. They weren't built with public services. They were built to disconnect people. And if you are moving there while in poverty, you are going to have a challenge. You're going to have new challenges, and the governments in these suburban communities are not very well prepared. And so what this has led to is this idea of the Patchwork Metropolis, Whereas before we had the monocentric model, right? This is a review. We had the monocentric model. The center of the city should be most wealthy. We flipped that in the United States around the 1940s. Outside of the city became the most wealthy. The center of the city became the poorest. Now we have what's called the Patchwork Metropolis. Suburbs are declining, suburbs are rich. Cities are declining, cities are rich. It's all neighborhoods and slivers within it. If you walked 10 miles outside of the center of Atlanta, you wouldn't be able to guess whether you would end up in a poor neighborhood or a rich neighborhood if you didn't know what direction you were going. And this puts up a huge strain on regional governance. All of these different communities need different things now, right? But they're all governed by their local property. So you have counties that are getting subdivided and new governments founding within them because the last remaining wealthy residents don't want to share resources with the new arrivals that are living in the affordable housing. And I think that this raises sort of the limitation of using the private market to create affordable housing. And this is getting sort of fanciful and beyond the realm of what I think is possible. I think getting rid of zoning is more likely. We could take public housing seriously and transportation. Cities often want to build light rail lines and put in $1 billion in order to move a few thousand people between the airport and downtown. I am an advocate of bus rapid transit. I think that buses are effective. It uses the infrastructure we already have. They are affordable. $1 billion in buses would go a long way and would make it a lot easier for people to get from wherever they live to wherever they need to work. If you look across the literature, economic mobility, the ability to move from low income to high income, is greatly benefited by public transit. And that's why Europe and Canada are beginning to outstrip us pretty significantly in their economic mobility. Because if you are poor, you are trapped now, and you are not going to be able to access the resources you need. If we took transportation seriously and public housing seriously, we may be able to avoid a lot of these problems. And we don't have to build all new housing for public housing. We don't have to create new taxes. We spend more, the federal government spends more subsidizing mortgages like mine than it does on public housing. These are not radical investments in order to create housing that people can live in order to take that strain off of them. We choose to put our resources in different places, building new highways instead of rebuilding the ones that already exist. Right? The structure of our subsidies are leading to these problems. And if we simply redirect the money that we're already spending on urban development towards smarter development, we may be able to help some of these problems. Beyond that, the more radical sort of solution that I have is that cities need to start investing in long-time residents. If cities are headed towards another fall and the cyclical nature of underdevelopment and gentrification and underdevelopment and gentrification, I think the smarter route is for cities to invest in their residents during the downfall, similar to a team investing in the players that they already have in order to stay relevant. And what they can do is find ways to redirect abandoned properties, declining properties, to the residents that already live in their cities and return the neighborhoods to those that lived in them for a long time. One way to do this that's already been established is community land trusts. A community land trust buys the property underneath the house while selling the house to an individual. So when you're buying a property, you're buying both the land and the home. The land is nice, but it probably doubles the cost of the property. If a community land trust, which is run as a nonprofit, buys the land, the down payment gets reduced by half. And this is a great way to expand ownership of homes to low and moderate income families. It still builds in that they have to pay a mortgage. This isn't a giveaway. It's been done by a nonprofit. But finding ways to expand these projects can help to ensure home ownership for more communities. Home ownership has a lot of benefits. It was oversold in the mid-2000s, right? And that actually led to some of the negative consequences of the Great Recession. If we could find a way to actually harness home ownership in moderate income families, it would lead to sort of greater investment in these neighborhoods, especially for people that have already lived in them for a long time. Gentrification has real costs for families. There was a recent study of low-income children defined by whether they were living in a gentrifying or not gentrifying neighborhood. They didn't go to the doctor anymore, but those living in a gentrifying neighborhood were more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression. These effects of being housing insecure and being displaced have real costs for children and families. Finding ways for cities to stabilize themselves and become less reliant on these boom and busts, I think is the way that the cities need to move out of this crisis and avoid the next one. Thank you.